Scene one, ample, take one.
We're all very concerned about the state of the ice sheet on Greenland because that's water that's tied up outside of the ocean, and should that melt, and we see lots of indication that there is increased rate of melting of the Greenland ice sheet, that can have an impact on sea level.
The huge uncertainty we have in all the predictions of future sea level rise is due to the glacial system, because we do not understand how they will behave in a warming climate. We do not understand the dynamics of them.
Ice shelves and ice sheets and big glaciers, they don't respond linearly to climate change. So it's hard for us to comprehend how they respond to the changing world that we're in right now.
The Petermann 2015 expedition is a perfect example of how we study iconic systems. This is a canary in the coal mine for how the world works, how the world changes. In particular, what's interesting about this place is it has a floating ice shelf that protects a glacier that extends deep into Greenland's interior. It's sort of the drain of Greenland.
An ice shelf is also resisting, it has a buttressing force on the rest of the ice sheet or the glacier that feeds into it. So if you take that away, you will affect it and it may start to increase its flow out into the ocean.
And these northern outlet glaciers, like the Petermann, are more protected. They're in a colder environment. And so we're catching the Petermann Glacier while it still has an ice shelf. It's important to be able to look at this one before it's gone.
So we're setting out to observe the glacier, observe the record of its change through the sediments and through the deposits left by past glaciers.
Chatter marks say.
Okay.
So I think I'll believe it.
You see all the striations? So the glacier comes along holding rocks, and it scrapes it like this. A little slower than that.
Come back in 200 years.
When you have a past extension of an ice, it leaves imprints as the ice stream go along out on the seafloor. And they are very, what we call mega-scale glacial lineations. So we see them with our instruments on board.
The part we're looking at with the multi-beam sonar, mapping out the surface of the seafloor, is the impact of the glacier itself on the seafloor sediments. You can think of the glacier as a big river of ice. It's very powerful. It's going to scrape them and shape them. People can read those shapes on the seafloor, read these characteristic forms on the seafloor that indicate the presence of a glacier and even the direction of the glacier.
So,
that's 2 lines?
We have done a lot of great mapping, and what we have seen, very preliminary results, is that ice has flowed through Petermann Fjord and has entered Nares Strait and turned northward in the past. One very cool result that we have from the mouth of Petermann Fjord is that there looks to be an older grounding line, and the grounding line is where the icy part of the glacier is in contact with the bed, and you can see a quite characteristic wedge-shaped deposit that was probably formed underneath the glacier when it sat there for a period of time in the past.
So we can see that, we can see the landforms, but then we also need to date it. Then we take sediment cores and we look at the deposition on top of the landforms, and we use different methods to date the sediments and also the succession of the sediments.
We have a big rock.
Oh, that's heavy. Wow. All right, we'll see what we got here.
And from that we can figure out how the ice behaved and when it behaved.
you want to guess the bottom age?
I would say it's older than 10,000 calendar.
Okay.
That's my guess.
All right. Fearless prediction.
After we've looked at all the core properties, we've looked at the colour and grain size and all those sorts of things, then we'll take a small sample and we'll wash the sediment out and we'll look for foraminifera, which are these marine organisms.
Now we have Riddersalis umbenatus.
They leave behind tests or shells, and we can figure out which species were living in the sediments through time. And the species have environmental preferences. You know, I might have made assumptions that there wouldn't be no life under an ice shelf because the forams, they need food, and the place where the food is produced is in the surface ocean where there's light. But it appears from early results that there is life under the ice shelf.
Having ice over the top doesn't necessarily preclude life from being beneath the ice shelf. You have this warm water circulating around the base of the fjord, you have cold water coming out at the top of the fjord, so you have this sort of refreshment of nutrients, so things can live beneath the ice shelf.
One of the most incredible things about this project, and a very important scientific piece of this project, is being able to acquire a sediment core beneath the floating part of Petermann. Underneath ice shelves are very hard areas to access. We don't really have any good idea of what an ice shelf sediment looks like. So then if we go to places where there might have been ice shelves in the past, we can't really tell whether there was an ice shelf there or not because we have no frame of reference. With this first sediment core that we've collected from beneath the Petermann ice shelf, we can actually fully characterize what an ice shelf sediment or mud looks like for this environment. And then we can go look at our sediments in the fjord or even further out in Nares Strait, and we might be able to tie down whether there was an ice shelf there and at what time that happened in the past.
We drilled through the ice shelf here. The ice is about 380 metres thick, in fact, at this site, and found about 300 or 400 metres of water beneath. This is straight ocean water.
Petermann Glacier is being melted to 70, 80, maybe even 85% by the ocean underneath. So it's only 10% which is being melted during the short summer when there's 24 hours of daylight. It looks big because you have ponded water everywhere on the glacier. That looks big in the summer, but the summer is only 6 weeks or 8 weeks long, and the rest, it's still total darkness. The ocean underneath is warm all the time, so that is a process that's acting year-round. We have instrumented 1/2 of the glacier. So we have 3 stations, both above the surface, radars mostly, and below the surface, which is measuring ocean temperature and salinity at 2 to 5 different vertical levels.
And what we're finding is at the very bottom of the ice is the temperatures are really quite high, which is very exciting.
This water is warm. Maybe not warm in the sense that we're used to, but in oceanographic terms, in deep water terms, that is really warm. So it could melt everything, yet it doesn't, and we don't know why. The ocean is made of various blobs of different water masses. And these water masses have temperature and salinities, and hence densities. And that's the key. The density actually controls at which depth this water is allowed to be. Petermann, the water that comes in and is responsible for melting the ice, comes actually from the Atlantic Ocean.
660 meters. So you can start your launching procedure.
This Atlantic water is a very dense water because it's very salty. And that's why it is allowed to travel throughout the basin and be left relatively undisturbed. Relatively because it was 3 to 4 degrees warm in Fram Strait when it came into the Arctic. And by the time it reached Petermann, it was only 0.3 degrees. So it did cool down, and it changed also a bit its salinity. But we can still recognize that it's this water. All these staircase-like features that indicate that there's some mixing happening and some water masses meeting, probably meeting in different directions as well. And we can't measure that directly, but by looking at these profiles, we can get already a feel of what is happening where.
So we think this kind of behavior at Petermann is typical of many of the glacier systems. The question is how that heat that's trapped down on the bottom of the fjord is trapped there because the water's salty and therefore dense. How does that get up and melt the ice that's above it?
When we started this experiment in August of 2015, we did not expect to see as much up and down in temperature of 1 degree centigrade, that's about 2 or 3 degrees in Fahrenheit, because we thought, gee, we're 30 or 40 kilometers inshore away from the ocean where the fjord is open in the summer. It drops by 1 degree centigrade, and then 2 weeks later it drops again. So each of these thin bars are 2 weeks apart. And you see that they line up. There's a drop. This is the meltwater arriving, pulse, and then it goes back up to the ambient Atlantic water and drops again, up, down. And there is these pulses. This may suggest that we need to include tides in the way that the ocean melts Petermann or other ice shelves like Petermann. And we didn't know that before we put these instruments in there. If you would have asked me a year ago, I said, tides, and probably not.
So those instruments will never be recovered. They're there forever. The wires are now frozen into the ice shelf, and they're never going to come out again. So it's a one-way journey for those instruments when they went down there. But they're doing a good job, and it's a sacrifice they made well.
We, at the moment, don't really understand how fast these systems can change. We don't necessarily always understand what the drivers, or the specific drivers at least, of these changes are.
We have, for example, measured seafloor features that show that we have big collapses of ice shelf systems that is literally collapse over days and months and then break up, expel a lot of ice into the ocean.
That's the most important thing, is finding out whether this system is basically stable. That would be one finding, but the other finding, and the one we think we're going to see based on our initial evidence, is that its previous retreat was very rapid.
We're looking for these cosmically derived atoms, and those atoms are being formed when they're exposed to the atmosphere. We look for granitic boulders or sandstone, anything with quartz in it, because we're trying to measure an isotope that's trapped in the quartz lattice, so the mineral structure of the quartz. Because these rocks aren't from the local landscape, we know that they must have come from somewhere in the interior of Greenland. So the only way to transport a rock 200 to 300 kilometers away is for the glacier to have picked it up at its origin and moved it along in the ice itself. And then when the ice all melts out, all the boulders fall out of the ice.
All right, which one's next?
That one.
So we want to look at this array of boulders scattered across the landscape and see if the dates move in sequence, whether the glacier retreated slowly or whether it all happened at once very rapidly in a collapse event.
So where we're standing probably was covered in ice similar to about the Petermann is now, so probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 feet of ice, maybe more.
We know there was a lot more ice there in the past. The group collecting boulders went around and found boulders all over the place. That means the ice was there, the ice dropped the boulders. The other piece of it is the sea level terraces. We can see old beaches. They may be 100, 120, 150 meters up above modern sea level. So that means there was a lot of ice there.
When we go out and do these beach surveys, our main goal is to reconstruct this history of relative sea level.
Everywhere around the world, sea level is rising and falling relative to the land. And that's normally influenced by two factors. One is the water gets more or less in the ocean, and the other one is very relative to the location where you are.
Good that we did the smaller area first to get a feel for it.
Around here, what's really dominant is the weight of the ice sheet, and as that got removed, the land kind of bounces back from the ocean, so the land kind of rises above the ocean.
What's really neat around here is you can see evidence of that uplift. And so there are these raised marine terraces along the shorelines, and because these terraces were formed underwater, we can look for things that were living there at the time, or the remains of things that were living there at the time that it was at sea level, like shells.
Oh, look at that. That's just fantastic. It's weathered a little bit. Here, let's do it the old-fashioned way. Ooh, it's salty. Just picked that up, that little seashell, and it looks quite pristine. And this one might be, well, I'm not sure where we are right now. We're We're maybe, I don't know, several meters above sea level, but it might even be a few thousand years old. So, right there. And we'll get a radiocarbon date on that, and then we'll know.
Yeah.
81?
Yeah.
33.3.
Lost it. But I saw two.
What we're interested in is to find the rate at which this land was uplifted. If we find the rate at which the land was going up, then eventually we hope to calculate the load of the ice mass itself that was laying on top before. And then we are hoping to interlink that with the boulder team on the beach. And they are looking at where the ice that was formerly on Greenland, how that was actually distributed on the land.
And all those things will then combine to tell us why this ice sheet was moving across the landscape as it was, how did it get to its present position, and we give a chronology of how fast it was changing and where it was during certain points in time. And that gives us a more complete story of the Petermann system as a whole. Science.
When we get back from this expedition, people will look at these pieces individually, but one of the biggest targets will be to draw this all together and build a big picture or kind of unravel the glacial history of the Petermann Fjord area. And why that's important to us today is because Petermann Glacier is experiencing changes with ongoing climate change. There is warm water entering the fjord. There are large calving events where pieces of the ice shelf are breaking off and drifting out. And we want to know whether the rate of changes that we are seeing today are the kind of natural rate of changes that we might have seen in the past according to rising temperatures after the last glacier, for example, or whether they're much accelerated because climate change is accelerated today.
Bears have four-wheel drive.